Welcome back. Time now for a look at today's newspapers with Barbara Serra.
Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the journalist and author Christina Patterson and the barrister and broadcaster Andrew Eborn. Welcome both. So let's see what is on some of those front pages. Well, the Mail on Sunday reports that the Prime Minister has warned that Britain faces being overwhelmed by illegal migration, which will, quote, destroy our democracy. While the Sunday Telegraph reports that hostile states are using migration to destabilize the West. The Foreign Secretary David Cameron has joined his German counterpart in calling for a sustainable Gaza ceasefire. That's the front of the Sunday Times. The Observer reports that the PM's missed targets on waiting lists and beds could leave the NHS facing a winter crisis. The Sunday Mirror splashes on Alex Batty's return to the UK following his ordeal in France. And the Sunday People also leading with the British teenager's return after being missing for 6 years. Now, two rugby players whose £9 million motor neuron disease campaign moved the British public are to be honoured in the King's New Year's honours list. That's on the front of the Sunday Express. And the Daily Star on Sunday says 1 in 3 of us will flee our relatives over Christmas for some me time in the garden. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us. And as I mentioned, we're joined tonight by Christina Patterson and Andrew Eborn. OK, let's go straight to the front page of The Times. And here it is. Lord Cameron asking for a sustainable Gaza ceasefire. Interesting, maybe not quite a change of policy from the government, but certainly a change in the language that's used. What do you think, Andrew?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, he's joining forces with Germany to declare too many civilians have been killed. Enough is enough. And they say the sooner that it comes, the better. And this is the problem, as we touched on earlier, is that basically there are lots of questions to be asked. Netanyahu, I think, is going to be front and centre of those questions back in Israel. But I think the tragedies that we've been polluting the media for the last several weeks. Basically, enough is enough. We need to try and find that sustainable ceasefire.
I mean, it's interesting that he's speaking with the German foreign minister, because actually Germany has been incredibly pro-Israel. I mean, all Western nations are, but, you know, maybe for historical reasons, whatever, it's complicated, but very, very pro-Israel. So it's interesting that, you know, the ongoing violence that we're seeing on the Strip, you know, words that we're hearing coming out of the government that a two-state solution isn't really on the cards. Do you think it's swaying people's minds and governments' minds, Christina?
Yes, I'm afraid this is so often what happens with Israel is that they're, I mean, often, obviously, for example, when it comes to the settlers and what they're doing in the West Bank and the violence they're wreaking there is no justification for that. But I think in a situation like this, where Israelis were subject to the most brutal, horrific attack, then anybody right-minded would have to be on the side of Israel in saying this is not acceptable and Israel has the right to respond to that. But so often what happens with Israel, tragically, is it then goes just far too far. And of course, you know, if destroying Hamas is your objective, that's a very, very difficult objective to achieve because, as we know, there are hundreds of miles of tunnels under Gaza, and Hamas have embedded themselves among civilians and in civilian buildings like hospitals and schools and so on. However, destroying the whole of Gaza, and so far about 20,000 people, and indeed killing your own hostages, which we'll get on to in a moment, is clearly not the way to destroy Hamas, and it's certainly not the way to destroy any terrorist aspirations that people may have.
You mentioned the hostages. Let's take a look now at the front page of The Observer. And of course, it's the story of those 3 hostages shot by the IDF. And it turned out that they were waving white flags. They also came out shirtless, presumably to show that they weren't wearing suicide vests. And obviously, I mean, there was a news conference by the War Cabinet, Netanyahu and 2 other ministers, obviously devastated, saying the country's heartbroken. But it does show that, you know, perhaps some soldiers in the IDF are shooting first and asking questions later.
I think that's absolutely right, and it's tragic, absolutely tragic, and you can understand the surge of emotion as a result of what's happened. And as you say, they were waving a white flag, they were bare-chested to try and do everything they can to turn around and say that this is us, we're either going to be surrendering or we're on your side. And I think, again, questions need to be asked about the mindset, if you like, of these soldiers, and having a look at why that would happen in those sort of circumstances. But there's going to be lots of questions which are going to be unpacked. But certainly the feelings on the street are exactly what you said, is outrage, I think, on all sides.
Mind you, Israel is still standing behind the IDF and the war effort. But I mean, I suppose, you know, all the leaders always mention the increased number of civilians being killed in Gaza. OK, let's go to front page of the Daily Mail. And that is Rishi Sunak, illegal migrants will overwhelm the UK. Now, he was speaking at a conference on Saturday in Rome with his very good friend Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, and they share this, I guess, shared battle against illegal migration. What did you make of what you heard come out of the conference?
I thought it was pretty disgusting, actually, and the conference itself is not exactly sweetness and light. People like Steve Bannon have been guests in the past. It's not, as Rishi Sunak called it, he calls Giorgia Meloni centre-right. She is not a centre-right leader. It is not a centre-right conference. The people who have taken part in it and continue to take part in it are generally on the far right. And this whole language of being swamped, being overwhelmed, it's just very unhelpful. There are realities, of course, that many countries in the world have horrible regimes or poverty that makes escape to the West a very attractive proposition, and one's heart goes out to anyone who wants to do it. And it is also not possible for the West to take all those people, and not least since most of them are young men, and it's not fair that it should be only young men who get access to you know, what the West has to offer. But to speak of people in such extremely pejorative ways, I think it's pernicious. And also, it's a distraction from the fact that the Tories have allowed record levels of migration, 740,000 net migration figures for last year. So it's just a distraction.
Legal migration.
Legal migration.
Andrew, if we can just take a look at the Sunday Telegraph, because it's the same story. And again, we can look at language. So front page of the Sunday Telegraph. Again, the Prime Minister, hostile states using migration to destabilise the West. I mean, what exactly is he saying? And again, what do you make of it?
Well, he's saying the Asylum Convention revamp needed to stop countries being overwhelmed. It's the same sort of issue, really. He's basically sort of turning around and saying we need to address this as a matter of urgency. The figures are incredibly alarming. In the last few days, they have sort of introduced this policy which they reckon will reduce it by 300,000 about family members and so on and so forth. But it's the point that we touch on is that some of the people over here, some of the jobs that need to be done are dependent on making sure that this works in a sustainable way. But we then undoubtedly need to turn around and say, well, do they need to bring family members and so on and so forth? And there are particular different views on both sides. Some people saying it's not going to affect that sort of side, but I would think that for some of the jobs where they're difficult to find people, it will have an impact.
Well, one of those jobs, or certainly where help is needed, is the NHS. We've got two stories, of one not so good about the NHS, but one good news. Start us with the Observer, Christina. NHS winter crisis as Rishi Sunak fails to meet targets.
Well, the NHS generally has crises in the winter, and it's been left in very poor shape after the pandemic. And Rishi Sunak again made a rash promise, like his small boats promise, that he would solve the problems, and those promises have been broken. Of course, all the strike action hasn't helped, but the strike action has not been very well handled by the government. It looks as if now, with a new health secretary, there is a slightly better tone, and she seems more sort of keen on building better relationships with people working in the NHS. But every single winter in this country, we have a crisis in the NHS, and people turn up and they have just horrific experiences at A&E. There are people left waiting in hospital corridors. Honestly, now, in this country, if you have a serious accident, you have no guarantee that you will be treated swiftly and safely. And, you know, it's in a very poor state. And I think someone has got to sort that out. And I do think the Labour government which surely is coming this way, will do a better job than the Tories.
Andrew, if you have anything to add to that, but also I know that you've got a good story, a good news story from The Times.
It's great to have a good story. Well,
yes.
adding to that, first of all, you need to look at efficiencies in the NHS, but also embracing technology. I'm a big advocate for artificial intelligence and how that will bring those efficiencies.
So is Wed Streeting.
Exactly, absolutely. And the great thing about artificial intelligence, it's also helping to discover the cures for diseases. And there's a great new hope for a blood test to detect the killer sepsis, which kills, I think, about 48,000 people a year. And what they've done is they've got this new blood test now saying it can rapidly detect whether a person has sepsis. So we are looking for the good stories, and thank goodness it's there on the front page of The Times for us.
Good. We need some good news stories. Andrew and Christina, for the moment, thank you. Well, coming up, procreate like me, why Elon Musk has issued a call for people to have more children. And welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview, where I'm joined by Christina Patterson and Andrew Eborn. Welcome both. Let's go straight to the Daily Express. Front page, honours for rugby heroes. Now, this is the King's Honours list, and many of the gongs have gone to teammates who've raised £9 million for a campaign about motor neuron disease.
Yes, it's a fantastic cause, which they've looked at. Their fellow teammates suffered with motor neuron disease, and they've been raising not just money, but awareness as a result of their celebrity status. So Kevin Sinfield and Rob Burrow will be honoured by the King in his New Year's Honours list, and quite rightly so. They're basically raising awareness about motor neuron disease, and also this staggeringly impressive $9 million as well.
Yeah, well done then. Christina, let's go to the Telegraph. Front page, and not an article necessarily, but a cartoon. Matt, so there's Santa. Do you decide who's been naughty and who's been nice, or is it Gary Lineker?
Well, Gary Lineker seems to be a kind of hero or villain, depending on your political perspective. And there is continuing controversy about whether or not he should be as vocal in his political views as he is, given that he's employed by the BBC, and no doubt that will run and run, because he is just so precious to the BBC as you know, in his status as a sort of national treasure, really, that they seem to be unable to leash him, I suppose. Yeah. But I don't know. We had a dinner with some friends a few weeks ago, and one of them spent a big chunk of the evening talking about how angry he was with Gary Lineker. Really? And I think he really does polarise people, yes.
Where are you on the
I think it's very simple. Is the rules and regulations of the BBC need to be clear. What's been said is that they are allowed, if you're not a news person, but you're a presenter, you're allowed to have views on political issues. But the key is you've got to have a high standard of civility. So he's signed up to this letter opposing what's going on in Gaza and opposing all sorts of other things about Rwanda and so on and so forth. And he's always hitting the headlines about that sort of side. But he's allowed to have opinions on that, they've said, according to the rules. What he's not allowed to do is to be rude about it when people sort of turn around and criticise him. So that's what's being investigated at the moment.
OK. Let's go to someone who is never shy about voicing his opinions, and that's Elon Musk. Front page of the Sunday Times. It's a picture of him with his son, one of his 11 children. And the reason that the picture is there is it says, procreate like me, because one of the issues that came up at this conference was the low birth rate, pretty much everywhere in Europe, in the West. And he's saying that people should have as many children as he has. Christina, what did you make of it?
Well, I mean, you know, I think if we all lived our life in the way that Elon Musk did, the world would be an extremely strange place. He also said recently that nobody would be working in the future, but it would be fine because we'd all have a very generous...
Because of AI.
You know, because we'd have a very generous sort of universal income, essentially. I don't really think any of us turn to Elon Musk for our life lessons and wisdom, not least because he acquired his children through various different forms, including, one assumes, very expensive surrogacy. So it probably helps to be extremely rich if you're going to have 11 children. But hey, good luck to the man. He's he does some good in the world. His Starlink has been useful to Ukraine and all kinds of places, but he is a complete and utter weirdo, it has to be
He
said.
does raise a valid point, though, about the plummeting birth rates.
Oh, absolutely. And I have to, I always play devil's advocate. I'm a musketeer, I'll call it. You can work on that sort of basis. No, he's done a lot of great good. He's got a differently wired brain. He's talked very publicly about that. But the call for everybody to have 11 children, they are very expensive children. And it's not just the initial stages, but what is it, about $250,000 they're working out per child.
They try not to think like
I
that,
know,
but yeah.
but it does look like that sort of stuff. So I think you need to have deep pockets like Elon. But he basically, I've spoken to his father on various programmes as well. They've got a very interesting family. But he's also getting people to challenge the way that they think things. And I'm a big, big fan about, as I say, about AI and how that's going to revolutionise jobs. Basically, he's talking about the world of abundance, where people don't need to work. They can choose to work if they want to, but they won't need to.
So do you agree with him that we're not going to need to
Absolutely.
work?
I talk around the world about the benefits of AI and encourage people to embrace it. I say these seismic changes in medicine, in the way that in the creative arts and so on and so forth. But there are all sorts of questions, including about copyright, because obviously these machines need to learn in order to have their output, and making sure that people like actors are rewarded. It was front and centre of the Hollywood strike, you remember, for both writers and also actors. And we need to make sure, so Bruce Willis, for example, had aphasia. He couldn't act anymore, but AI created his name, his image and so on and so forth, and he was adequately handsomely rewarded by a Russian telecom company for the AI version of it.
I'm sorry to say, Andrew, but it's always rather well-off people who talk about the benefits of AI. If you are an impecunious writer or artist or journalist whose industry is being severely affected by these developments, you tend not to take quite such a rosy view.
Well, I think if they're a co-pilot, then that's the way to do it. First draft from AI, and then everybody will benefit.
I don't
Let's
think so.
finish on a Christmas story. Daily Star. Front page of the Daily Star on Sunday. This Christmas, I will mostly be hiding in the shed, this sort of suggesting to people who may have had enough of their relatives by the time pudding comes
I
around.
love the idea, go back to your point. 1 in 3 will flee relatives for me time in the garden. You're assuming, right, 1 in 3 people have a garden.
Exactly.
I find it extraordinary in sort of central London. But people do want their sort of private time, and sometimes there's a big pressure on people. You've got to have fun. So a bit of me time for everybody. I think it's important, wherever you might live, to try and find a bit of time for yourself. That is important.
Christina, do you escape family in the middle of Christmas?
Well, I don't have much family, actually, unfortunately. My family are no longer... both my siblings and both my parents have died, so I don't have much family. But I have recently acquired a garden for the first time in London with my partner, but the shed took up most of it. So we've actually just got rid of the shed in order to have a garden. So I won't be escaping to the shed because there isn't one.
Christina Patterson, Andrew Ebor, thank you both so much for having gone through the papers.